prisoner. The rain eased up in the early evening. He found out by asking on the street that a lot of long-haired types were found in Rembrandt Lane. This was a small square with cultivated beds of roses. The petals were still moist with rainwater and reflected the last sun of the day. 3 men and a young woman were sitting on a park bench, laughing and joking. "Willst hashish roken?" John inquired, using one of the few Dutch phrases that Hans had taught him. It turned out they were Germans and strangers themselves in Amsterdam. They didn't have any money, but willingly smoked with him on the park bench. John pointed to his sleeping bag. "Ik wil slapen." One of the men nodded, indicating he understood, and led John up a side street and along a canal. The houses were old and grimy here. One of the houses had a red hand painted on the door. "Bravo," the German said with a grin. They looked up and down the street to assure themselves that no one was looking, then quickly opened the door and slipped in, shutting it again after them. The hallway was pitch black. The bottom of the staircase was strewn with garbage. The German went first, showing John the way to a fairly clean but small room on the second floor. Here they lit a candle and laid their sleeping bags on the door. The windows were covered with thick blankets, so the light couldn't be seen from the street below. The German's head was wrapped in bandages. "Paris," he said proudly. John remembered hearing about the May riots in Paris. There were many people roaming about with bandages and casts from those days. John brought out the good Turkish hashish. About an hour later they were joined by 2 more men and the girl. In the morning John slipped out quietly to explore the city. Amsterdam's canals radiate out from the docks like spokes of a wheel. The water is green and dirty with floating refuse. Despite this, the canals, narrow paths, and bridges are picturesque. It was early summer now. The trees were green. Some of the canals were lined with newer stalls. The hashish made their fragrance unbelievably beautiful. It was early summer now. The trees were green, and some of the canals were lined with flower stalls. The hashish made their fragrance unbelievably beautiful. John was also fascinated by the numerous bookstores. He had never seen so many, even in Paris. Unlike Paris, though, about half their stock was in English. In the afternoon he went to Ledsplain. There was a bar there which was patronized by the artist Hippie Bravo people. He sold some hashish, enough to keep him in food and beer. Even more interesting was a place called the Chess Cafe. The patrons were older and more from the beatnik era. They played bridge, chess, and a Japanese game called Go. It was the game of Go which particularly fascinated John. He had played the game previously in 2 or 3 cities in North America, but nowhere had it been as popular as Amsterdam. In fact, he was told that Go tournaments were sometimes shown on the TV. In the evenings he would eat at a Chinese or Indonesian restaurant, developing a taste for curry and rice. Later he would walk leisurely along the canals. Amsterdam had an internationally famous red light district. Professional ladies sat behind plate glass windows. Potential customers could observe from the sidewalk. John stood wistfully before many a window before passing reluctantly into the shadows. On his 3rd night in the old derelict Bravo house, John, the 3 Germans, and the girl were sitting cross-legged on their sleeping bags. They had drawn the curtains and lit a candle. They spoke German, and John ignored the conversation, contented himself with smoking hashish in his white Dutch clay pipe. Shortly after midnight, the front door was pushed ajar and a wooden box kicked over. Immediately the conversation in the upstairs room stopped. One girl reached for the curtains, but John grabbed her arm and slowly shook his head, indicating it would be unwise. There was a silence and occasionally a creak. Suddenly the door burst open. They were blinded by the glare of a flashlight. With swift reflex motion, John swallowed the remaining 2 grams of hashish. There were 4 uniformed police. They quickly packed their sleeping bags and were herded down the stairs. A police van was waiting right outside the door. Once again, John felt himself entrapped by a wire mesh screen. They were taken either to a local police station or more likely the city jail. They were asked their names, nationality, and the length of their stay in Holland. They asked John how he got there. He made the mistake of telling them he had taken the bus from Belgium. He was told to empty his pockets. The contents were identified, signed for, and then sealed in a large manila envelope. They also kept his belt and shoes. After what seemed like an hour or more, they were led to the second-story cells. The Germans stayed together. John was put in a cell by himself. He slept well that night, despite the cold sheet metal bed. Perhaps it was the 2 grams of hashish he had been forced to swallow. In the morning they were served porridge for breakfast, and afterwards the Germans were taken from their cells. Later John learned they were driven to the German border and released. John remained in his cell for another 24 hours. The second night was less comfortable. He was jittery, whether from his sudden abstention from hashish and tobacco or due to claustrophobia, he wasn't sure. In the morning, taken from his cell and given back his personal belongings. He expected to be either released or taken to court. He was bundled into a police van where his sole companion was a young girl. John rolled a smoke from shag tobacco and offered her a cigarette. Will Zigaretten? He asked the girl. Yes, please, she smiled. John quickly rolled another one and lit a match for both of them. The first pull was beautiful. It not only calmed his nerves, but actually made him feel drunk with exhilaration. "You know where we are?" she asked curiously. "They're taking us to the Belgian frontier. Then they're putting me on a train for Luxembourg." She was transferred to a train at Roosendaal. John was driven to Essen on the border and was handed over to the Belgian police. It was late afternoon. He was taken to the local county jail. It was almost picturesque compared to the tiered cages of Amsterdam. It was simply the bedroom of a peasant's cottage. The only security was a barred window and a heavily bolted wooden door. There was a large bed with a stuffed straw mattress. The sheets were clean. There was a heavy cotton quilt to keep out the night chill. A previous prisoner had left a pocket novel on the table. John went to bed soon after he finished the meaty stew they gave him for supper. He read for a while, then listened to the crickets outside his window. It was easy to imagine the face of the runaway girl against the wooden rafter beams. He went to sleep reluctantly. In the morning he was given bread, cheese, and coffee for breakfast. About an hour later he was transferred to a station wagon with a policeman and a plainclothes detective. The detective spoke English, and they chatted along the way. John found out he was being taken to the prison in Antwerp. He didn't know what to expect since he was never formally charged with anything, but the detective thought it was likely that the embassy would secure his release. John wasn't so sure about it. It was less than a week since he'd been busted for panhandling in Antwerp, and the embassy had got him out of jail with strict orders never to return to Belgium. Ironically, he found himself being transported to Belgium. In any case, he would be expected to return to Canada, and this he would not do under any circumstances. If charged and convicted of vagrancy, the usual sentence was 6 months on a prison farm. John wondered what it would be like. From the outside, Antwerp prison was discouraging, to say the least. Its dull brick and iron sprawl looked something like John imagined the Nazi concentration camps must have looked like. From the inside it was less frightening, though hardly pleasing. He passed through 2 iron doors and was led down a hallway where he was given a signed receipt for his knapsack and sleeping bag. His personal things were put in a manila envelope, though he was allowed to keep his tobacco, papers, white clay pipe, and a brass Buddha. He was given a shower and then sprayed with a louse disinfectant. The prisoner's uniform was blue denim jeans and a flannel shirt. He was allowed to keep his shoes, which didn't have any laces. Then he was led up an iron staircase to a cell on the 3rd story. The door clanged shut, and the key was turned in the lock. John looked around. It wasn't as bad as he expected. The cell, number 71, was about 6 feet wide and 10 feet long. The walls were covered with peeling yellow paint, and there was a barred window about 6 feet up from the floor. By grabbing the bars with his hands and doing a chin-up, he was able to see out. The view was that of an empty exercise yard, and another block of cells across from him. There was a large brick wall topped with barbed wire enclosing the whole prison. The furniture in the cell was sparse. There was a green-painted table and chair, an iron bucket filled with 6 inches of water which served as a toilet, and an iron cot. He sat down on the bed, and the springs creaked under his weight. The mattress was of straw and not too uncomfortable. There were 2 cotton sheets and a gray woolen blanket. At 8 o'clock the siren beeped, and 5 minutes later the lights were shut out. John undressed in the dark and crawled into bed. The siren screamed again at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the lights came on. Outside he could hear the cries of seagulls. Inside there was the clang of metal doors opening and shutting. The noise became progressively louder as the guards worked their way down the hall. John lay back on the bed and tried to estimate how close they were. The door opened and 2 guards entered. They motioned to John to empty his iron bucket, which was beginning to smell, into a larger barrel being wheeled down the hall by a prisoner. Then they indicated he should make his bed. John said hello to them in English and then in French, but they ignored him and spoke Flemish amongst themselves. About 20 minutes later, the door opened again, and he was given a package of sugar cubes, bread and margarine, and coffee in a battered tin cup. He was given a spoon and a dull knife, which was numbered 71. These knives were collected after breakfast, and each one strictly accounted for. John rationed his sugar cubes to 3 a day. It was also necessary to ration his tobacco. He rolled 12 cigarettes, but had no idea how long they would have to last him. One definite bonus was the white Dutch clay pipe. He had smoked hashish in it for nearly 2 months, and resin had built up inside the bowl and stem. His package of Lorraine cigarette papers had a razor blade inside the cover for promotional purposes. Strangely enough, the guards hadn't noticed. It was to prove a useful tool. He smashed the white clay pipe on cement floor and scraped the resin from the broken pieces. There was enough to roll 5 small joints, and they made the first 2 days more bearable. He smoked them a little at a time so the odor wouldn't be noticeable. The best part of the day was the early morning as the sun came up and the birds began to chirp. A song from Brendan Behan's play, The Queer Fellow, kept running through his head. It went something like this. I greet the dawning, the guard's warning, get out of bed and clean up yourself. The old triangle goes jingle jangle along the banks of the Royal Canal. A hungry feeling comes o'er me stealing, and the mice are squealing in my prison cell. The old triangle goes jingle jangle along the banks of the Royal Canal. As the day progressed, he became bored and looked for something to do. He was kept in solitary. The only people he saw were the guards, who came 3 times a day with his food. It was inevitable that he did a lot of thinking, but in order not to go stir-crazy, he invented several projects. One of these was a sheet or paper tied with thread from which he made a lampshade. This transformed the glare of the bare light bulb into something softer and more homely. He spent a long time staring at the wooden crucifix which hung above his head. It reminded him that Christ, too, had once been a prisoner. Amongst the things he had been allowed to take in the cell with him was a spool of white thread. It was very fine, but he found by layering 5 or 6 lengths side by side and then braiding it, he was able to twist it into a fairly thick and sturdy piece of string. Into this string he tied 32 knots, patterned after Tibetan prayer beads. It became in effect a rosary with which he practiced pranayama exercises. This is a branch of Hindu yoga which regulates breathing. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, he would inhale slowly, slipping the knots through his fingers to the count of 32. He held his breath for a similar amount of time, and then exhaled slowly, again to the count of 32. An established pattern developed which was almost hypnotic. He had done such exercises before, but it was much more effective with the knots, because he didn't have to keep track of the numbers, and could let his mind free to meditate. After these exercises, he felt relaxed and tranquil. The worst time was at night. The loneliness was greatest then. He stared softly at the brass Buddha incense burner. The lights went out whether you were tired or not. It was frustrating to have so little control over your environment. It was the 8th day he had been in prison, and so far he had spoken English to no one. He had never seen a court or a judge. No charges had been laid, nor there had been any indication of when this would happen. The next day was Sunday, and he was asked whether he was Catholic. He said yes, because he wanted to go to Mass. He simply watched the other prisoners and followed their lead. It was good to be out of the cell and be amongst other men again. After Mass, he was taken to the Warden's office. John stood with his legs apart and his hands behind his back. He demanded that he be informed of the charges against him. "There are no charges," the Warden said simply. "Then why are you holding me?" "It's illegal to walk the streets of Belgium without papers and a minimum of $10. If you did so, we would have to charge you with vagrancy, and we can't let you break the law." "What do you mean?" "As soon as you show us you have $10, you are free to go." "How am I going to get $10 while I'm in prison?" The Warden shrugged his shoulders. "Friends, perhaps? In any case, that's not our concern." "Can I send a telegraph?" John asked. The Warden shook his head. "You will be given one stamp and envelope per month. From now on, you will be permitted 10-minute exercises per day, and you will be allowed to use the facilities of the prison library." He smiled. "We have quite a good selection of English books, which were bought when the prison was built. It is very rare that anyone uses them for it, however." After the interview, he was fingerprinted and then photographed for police records. He was returned to his cell. By this time, his supply of cigarettes was deleted, and he was reduced to unwrapping his carefully stashed butts. He re-rolled them very thinly. Tobacco didn't taste very good, but satisfied his craving for nicotine. The next day, the guard brought a book from the prison library. It hadn't been used very much, for although the binding was still firm, the pages were yellowed with age. It was a first edition, printed in 1890, and appeared to be a sociological tract on the London slums. In particular, a bad slum called Ladbroke Grove, which happened to be where he had stayed in London. John was fascinated by the strange vocabulary and social outlook. Reading the book was like going back in time. The guards also brought him a pencil, paper, envelopes, and a stamp. John was dismayed to find it to be an ordinary stamp. His request for an airmail stamp was refused. Originally, he had planned to write his parents explaining his position and requesting a $10 money order to secure his release from prison. According to his calculations, however, it would take at least a month for the letter to travel by ship and arrive in Canada. With some reluctance, he addressed the letter to the Canadian Embassy in Belgium and asked them to transmit his message by telegraph. He spent the next 3 days waiting for a reply. The monotony of those long hours was broken somewhat by the 10-minute exercise period. In the early afternoon, the guards fetched him and 4 other prisoners from the same wing and escorted them to the yard. They were left in a brick enclosure about 10 feet wide and 20 long. They were locked in by an iron grill. The walls were 10 feet high and the roof was covered by a mesh of barbed wire. Through this wire the sun shone. It was the first breath of fresh air John had had since arriving at Antwerp prison. It was also the first time he had a chance to meet and talk with other prisoners. His 4 companions were also foreigners. They were Muslims. 2 of them were from Morocco, 1 from Algeria, and 1 from Turkey. They were all being held for minor offenses such as working without a permit, overstaying their visa, or failing to produce proper identification. The Algerian had been there 3 months. He expected eventually to be deported. The men walked in circles, laughing amongst themselves and sharing their precious cigarettes. A dirt pathway was worn smooth by their shuffling feet. The stunted grass was pale and anemic from lack of sunlight. Overhead, seagulls circled with their plaintive cries. Between them and the prisoners was barbed wire. John envied them their freedom. They were so close, and yet so far away. The end.